The morning sun cast long shadows across Westminster Abbey as stood before the ornate mirror in her private chamber. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the silk fabric of her ceremonial dress. Today was not just any day, it was the day that would change everything. The day William would be crowned King of England, and she would become Queen Consort. The reflection staring back at her seemed almost foreign. Gone was the carefree university student who had met William at. Gone was the young woman who had nervously attended her first royal engagement. In her place stood a woman who had been shaped by years of public scrutiny, personal growth, and an unwavering love for a man who was born to rule. Sarah, her longtime dresser and confidant, approached quietly with the final pieces of jewelry. The diamond tiara caught the morning light, sending tiny rainbows dancing across the stone walls. Had worn many beautiful pieces over the years, but nothing compared to the weight of this moment, both literal and metaphorical. "Your Royal Highness," Sarah whispered softly, "it's time." Nodded, though her throat felt tight with emotion. She had practiced this moment countless times in her mind, had prepared for years, yet nothing could have her for the actual feeling of standing at the threshold of destiny. Meanwhile, several corridors away, William paced in his chamber. His ceremonial robes lay carefully arranged on the four-poster bed, each piece representing centuries of tradition and responsibility. The weight of his future crown seemed to press down on him even before it touched his head. His private secretary knocked gently before entering. "Your Royal Highness, the Archbishop has arrived. The abbey is filling with guests." William paused his packing and looked out the tall window overlooking the ancient courtyard. Below, he could see the last of the invited dignitaries making their way toward the abbey. World leaders, members of parliament, representatives from the Commonwealth nations, all gathered to witness this historic moment. But his thoughts weren't on the pomp and circumstance. They were on the journey that had brought them here, from two nervous university students to this moment that would define the rest of their lives. He remembered their first meeting clearly. Had been carrying a stack of art history books, her long hair falling in waves around her shoulders. She had laughed at something her friend had said, and the sound had stopped him in his tracks. There had been no fanfare, no royal protocol, just two young people finding each other in the most ordinary way. Their courtship had been anything but ordinary, though. Every date was scrutinized, every public appearance analyzed by media around the world. Had handled it all with a grace that had amazed him, even when the pressure seemed overwhelming. There had been difficult moments, the brief breakup that had left them both heartbroken and confused, the media frenzy that had followed everywhere, making simple tasks like grocery shopping impossible. The weight of knowing that their relationship wasn't just about them, it was about the future of the monarchy itself. But through it all, their love had endured. It had grown stronger, deeper, more resilient. Had proven herself not just as his partner, but as someone who truly understood the sacrifices that royal life demanded. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called. To his surprise, it was his father, King Charles, still wearing his mourning clothes before changing into his ceremonial attire. The older man's face carried the weight of his own recent coronation, but also something else, pride, perhaps, mixed with a hint of melancholy. "Son," Charles said simply, closing the door behind him, "how are you feeling?" William managed a small smile. Terrified, honored, ready, completely unprepared, all at the same time. Charles chuckled, a sound filled with understanding. "That sounds about right. I felt much the same when my time came." He moved to stand beside William at the window. "You know, I've watched you grow from a boy who was thrust into the spotlight too early into a man who truly understands what it means to serve. I couldn't be prouder." The words meant more to William than any ceremony could. His relationship with his father had been complex, shaped by tragedy and duty in equal measure. But in this moment, he felt the simple warmth of paternal love and approval. "Is remarkable," Charles continued. "She's brought stability to your life, joy to our family, and hope to the nation. Together, you'll make wonderful monarchs." William felt his eyes sting slightly. "I just want to be worthy of it all, of her faith in me, of the country's trust." "You already are," Charles said firmly. "But that doubt, that humility, it's what will make you great. A king who never questions whether he's doing enough, whether he's serving well enough, isn't really serving at all." Their conversation was interrupted by another knock. This time it was William's longtime valet, carrying the ceremonial sword that would be part of the ceremony. "It's time to begin dressing, Your Royal Highness," the man said respectfully. Charles clasped his son's shoulder once more. "I'll see you in the Abbey. Remember, this isn't just about duty today. It's about love for the nation, love for the institution we serve. Let that guide you." As his father left, William began the slow process of donning his ceremonial robes. Each piece had been worn by monarchs before him, carrying the weight of history and tradition. The fabric was heavy, ornate, almost overwhelming in its grandeur. But as he looked at himself in the mirror, he thought not of the kings who had come before him, but of waiting in her own chamber, going through her own preparations. They would walk into Westminster Abbey as Duke and Duchess. They would emerge as King and Queen. But more importantly, they would face this transformation together, as they had faced everything else in their marriage. Back in his chamber, the final preparations were complete. She stood before the mirror one last time, taking in the woman she had become. The girl who had worried about fitting in at university seemed like a lifetime ago. The young woman who had been nervous about meeting William's grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, felt like another person entirely. Yet at her core, she was still the same person who had fallen in love with a kind, thoughtful young man who happened to be a prince. She was still the woman who valued family above all else, who found joy in simple pleasures, who believed deeply in service to others. Sarah handed her the final piece, a small locket that had belonged to William's mother, Princess Diana, had rarely worn it in public, saving it for the most meaningful occasions. Today felt like the perfect moment to carry Diana's memory with her as she stepped into the role Diana had once been destined for. "She would be so proud," Sarah whispered, understanding the significance of the jewelry choice. Nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. Diana's absence was a shadow that had touched every major moment in her relationship with William. Their engagement, their wedding, the births of their children, all celebrations tinged with the sadness of knowing Diana would never see her son's happiness. But had learned to think of Diana not as an absence, but as a presence. She felt her mother-in-law's influence in William's kindness, in his dedication to charitable causes, in his determination to be present for his own children in ways his father hadn't always been able to be for him. A commotion in the courtyard below drew to the window. The ceremonial carriages were being prepared, their gold leaf gleaming in the strengthening sunlight. Crowds were already beginning to gather along the processional route, despite the early hour. She could see people of all ages, many wearing red, white, and blue, many carrying small Union Jack flags. The sight filled her with a mixture of humility and determination. These were the people she and William would serve. Not the dignitaries in the Abbey, important as they were, but ordinary citizens who had taken time from their daily lives to witness this moment of transition. Among the crowd, she spotted an elderly woman in a wheelchair, wrapped in a tartan blanket despite the mild weather. A young father was lifting his toddler daughter onto his shoulders to give her a better view. Teenagers were taking selfies with the Abbey in the background, their excitement palpable even from this distance. Each person had their own story, their own hopes and challenges. They weren't here just for pageantry. They were here because the monarchy represented something enduring in an uncertain world. They were here because they believed in the possibility that people could dedicate their lives to something larger than themselves. Felt the full weight of that responsibility settling on her shoulders, but rather than being crushed by it, she found herself standing. This was why she was here. This was what all the years of preparation had been leading toward. A gentle knock at the door announced the arrival of the palace coordinator. "Your Royal Highness, it's time to begin the procession to the Abbey." Took one last look in the mirror, one last deep breath. The woman looking back at her was ready. She had been shaped by love, by loss, by years of learning what it meant to serve. She was no longer becoming someone new. She had already become exactly who she needed to be. As she moved toward the door, her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from William. "See you at the altar, I love you." The simple words sent warmth flooding through her chest. Despite all the ceremony and tradition that awaited them, despite the weight of crowns and the burden of duty, at the heart of everything was something beautifully simple. Two people who loved each other, ready to face whatever came next together. The door opened and stepped into the corridor. Palace staff lined the walls, many of them people she had known for years. Their faces were filled with emotion, pride, excitement, and perhaps a touch of sadness for the end of one era and the beginning of another. She walked slowly, gracefully, toward the entrance where her ceremonial carriage waited. Each step brought her closer to the Abbey, closer to William, closer to the moment that would define the rest of their lives. The heavy palace doors opened ahead of her, and she could hear the distant sound of cheering crowds. The morning air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of the flowers that lined the processional route. Somewhere in the distance, church bells were beginning to ring, their ancient voices joining together in celebration. As emerged from the palace, the cheering grew louder. She could see the faces in the crowd more clearly now, young and old, people of all backgrounds united in this moment of shared history. Many were crying, overwhelmed by the emotion of the occasion. She lifted her hand in the gentle wave she had perfected over years of public appearances, but today it felt different. Today it felt like a promise to serve these people with all her heart, to honor their trust, to be worthy of their support. The carriage door was opened by a footman in full ceremonial dress. As she settled into the plush velvet seat, could see William's carriage ahead of hers in the procession. Even from this distance, even through the ornate carriage windows, she could sense his presence. They were about to embark on the final journey of their old lives and the first journey of their new ones. Together, as they had always been strongest. Together, as they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. The carriage began to move slowly forward and felt her heart lift with excitement rather than nervousness. This wasn't an ending. It was the most beautiful beginning she could imagine. The processional route from Palace to Westminster Abbey stretched before them like a river of celebration. Gazed out through the crystal-clear windows of her state carriage as thousands of faces blurred past, each one lit with excitement and anticipation. The ancient wheels rolled smoothly over the specially cleaned streets, but her heart hammered with the rhythm of the horses' hooves. She had traveled this route before, but never like this. Never with the knowledge that she would return as queen. The weight of centuries seemed to press against the carriage windows, as if the ghosts of every royal procession were traveling alongside her. Children pressed against the barriers, waving frantically with small flags clutched in their tiny fists. Their pure joy was infectious, cutting through any lingering nerves might have felt. One little girl, perhaps 5 years old, was dressed in a miniature version of her own blue dress, complete with a plastic tiara that caught the morning sunlight. The sight brought unexpected tears to Sighs. Somewhere in the crowd were her own children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, watching from a secure location with their nannies. She had kissed them goodbye that morning, each embrace lasting a little longer than usual. George had been serious and quiet, understanding more than his siblings about the significance of the day. Charlotte had been excited about the pretty dresses and horses. Little Louis had mostly been concerned about when they would have cake. The normalcy of that conversation, the simple concerns of children, had grounded her in a way that all the royal protocol could not. No matter what titles they would carry after today, they were still a family. They would still have bedtime stories and scraped knees and birthday parties. The crown would change many things, but not the most important things. As the carriage rounded a familiar corner, caught sight of her parents in the crowd. Michael and stood with the other specially invited guests, but their faces stood out to her among all the others. Her father looked distinguished in his morning suit, but she could see the emotion in his eyes even from this distance. Her mother was crying openly, one hand pressed to her heart. These were the people who had raised her in a middle-class home inn, who had taught her to work hard and be kind, who had supported her through every challenge and celebrated every joy. They had watched their daughter fall in love with a prince and had somehow never lost sight of the fact that she was simply their little girl. The carriage slowed as it approached the Abbey, and could see the magnificent Gothic architecture rising before them like a stone prayer reaching toward heaven. Westminster Abbey had hosted royal coronations for nearly 1,000 years. Every monarch since William the Conqueror had been crowned within those ancient walls, surrounded by the same vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows that would soon witness her own transformation. But it wasn't the history that made her breath catch in her throat. It was the sight of William's carriage arriving just ahead of hers, and the knowledge that in just a few moments they would be together again, facing this incredible moment as a team. The crowds pressed closer to the Abbey entrance, their cheers growing louder as the carriages came to a stop. Could see the red carpet that had been rolled out from the Great West Door, flanked by ceremonial guards in their finest uniforms. Television cameras from around the world were positioned at every angle, ready to broadcast this moment to billions of people. But found herself focusing on something much simpler, the way William turned to look back at her carriage, even though he couldn't see her through the formal protocol that surrounded them. Even separated by ceremony and tradition, they were connected by something much stronger. The carriage door opened and stepped onto the red carpet. The roar of the crowd was overwhelming, a wall of sound that seemed to lift her up and carry her forward. She had experienced crowd reactions before, but nothing like this. This was history unfolding, and everyone present seemed to understand the magnitude of the moment. Palace aides surrounded her immediately, adjusting her dress, checking that everything was perfect, but barely noticed their fussing. Her eyes were searching for William, who was going through his own preparations just yards away. When their eyes finally met across the formal chaos, everything else seemed to fade away. William smiled, that same boyish grin that had made her fall in love with him all those years ago. In that smile, she saw everything they had been through together. The late-night study sessions at university, the awkward first meetings with his family, the pressure of their public relationship, the joy of their wedding day, the wonder of becoming parents together. The abbey doors stood open before them, revealing the interior that had been transformed for this sacred occasion. Ancient stone columns soared toward heaven, draped with flowers and banners. The altar, where they would soon kneel to receive their crowns, gleamed with gold and precious stones. Hundreds of guests filled the historic pews, but barely registered their faces. The Archbishop of Canterbury appeared at the entrance, resplendent in his ceremonial robes. His face was serene but solemn, understanding the weight of the ritual he was about to perform. He had known William and for years had officiated at their wedding, had baptized their children. Today, he would crown them as king and queen. "Your Royal Highnesses," he said quietly, his voice carrying despite the crowd noise outside. "Are you ready?" Felt William take her hand, his fingers warm and steady. The simple touch grounded her, reminded her that beneath all the pageantry and protocol, this was still about them. About their partnership, their shared commitment to service, their love for each other, and for the nation they would now lead. "We're ready," William said, and heard the quiet confidence in his voice. He had found his peace with this moment, had embraced his destiny with the same grace he brought to everything else. Together, they stepped into Westminster Abbey, and the great doors swung closed behind them. The outside world, with its cameras and crowds and commentary, was shut away. Inside the abbey, there was only the soft glow of candlelight, the whispered prayers of centuries, and the sense that they were part of something infinitely larger than themselves. The processional music began, its ancient melody filling the vaulted space, and William began their slow walk down the aisle, their steps measured and dignified, but could feel the emotion rippling through the congregation as they passed. These weren't just spectators, they were witnesses to a sacred moment, participants in a ritual that connected them to centuries of British history. She caught glimpses of familiar faces as they walked, prime ministers and presidents, celebrities and dignitaries, but also ordinary citizens who had been chosen to represent the best of British society. Teachers and nurses, veterans and volunteers, young entrepreneurs and community leaders. These were the people she and William would serve, and seeing them here made the abstract concept of service feel immediate and personal. Halfway down the aisle, spotted an elderly woman sitting in one of the front pews. She recognized her immediately, Mrs. Henderson, who had been her children's piano teacher and had become a close family friend. The woman was crying openly, clutching a handkerchief and beaming with pride. The sight of this dear friend among all the grandeur reminded that despite the historic significance of this day, it was also deeply personal. As they approached the altar, the music swelled to a crescendo that seemed to lift the very stones of the ancient building. The Archbishop waited for them, flanked by other religious leaders from across the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. The ceremony that would unfold had been refined over centuries, each element carefully chosen to reflect both the sacred nature of monarchy and the democratic values of modern Britain. William and took their places before the altar, turning to face each other for a moment before the formal ceremony began. In that brief instant, they were not future king and queen, not public figures under the scrutiny of billions. They were simply two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life together based on love and mutual respect, who were about to embark on the greatest adventure of their lives. The Archbishop raised his hands, and the abbey fell into complete silence. Even the crowds outside seemed to sense the sacred moment beginning, their cheers fading to a respectful hush. In that silence, could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of history and the lightness of hope in equal measure. "Dearly beloved," the archbishop began, his voice carrying clearly through the ancient space, "we are gathered here in the sight of God and in the presence of this congregation to witness the coronation of William and as King and Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and of their other realms and territories, head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith." The words rolled over like a wave. Each title carried weight, responsibility, centuries of tradition. But they also carried hope, the hope that she and William could serve with wisdom and grace, that they could help guide their nation through whatever challenges lay ahead, that they could be worthy of the trust being placed in them. As the archbishop continued with the opening prayers, let her gaze drift upward to the soaring arches of the abbey ceiling. Generations of monarchs had knelt in this same spot, had felt the weight of crowns being placed on their heads, had made the same solemn vows she was about to make. Some had ruled in times of peace, others through war and upheaval. All had carried the hopes and dreams of their people. She thought of Queen Elizabeth II, William's grandmother, who had been crowned in this same abbey as a young woman not much older than was now. Elizabeth had dedicated her entire life to service, had weathered decades of change and challenge with grace and dignity. She had been a mentor to, teaching her through example what it meant to put duty before personal desire, to find strength in faith and family, to serve with quiet dignity. The weight of following in those footsteps was immense, but found herself feeling not overwhelmed but honored. She would bring her own gifts to the role, her empathy, her dedication to mental health advocacy, her ability to connect with people from all walks of life. She would not try to be someone else, but would be the best version of herself in service to others. The first part of the ceremony involved the recognition, where the archbishop would present William and to the congregation and ask for their consent to the coronation. This was the moment when the people would formally accept them as their sovereigns, a tradition that emphasized the relationship between monarch and subjects. "I here present unto you William, your undoubted king," the archbishop's voice rang out. "Wherefore all you who are come this day to do your homage and service, are you willing to do the same?" The response was immediate and overwhelming. "God save King William!" echoed through the abbey, the voices of hundreds joining together in a cry that had been heard in this place for centuries. The sound sent chills down spine, not from fear but from the profound sense of connection it represented. When her own recognition came, felt her heart swell with emotion. "God save Queen!" the congregation cried, and she understood in that moment that this was not just about her, not just about William, but about all of them together. The monarchy was not one person or even two people, it was a partnership between the crown and the people, a shared commitment to the values and traditions that bound them together as a nation. As the ceremony continued with the oath-taking, listen to William's strong, clear voice as he pledged to govern according to law and justice, to uphold the Protestant Reformed religion, to maintain the settlement of the Church of England. These were not empty words but sacred promises, commitments that would shape every decision they made for the rest of their lives. When her turn came to make her own vows, felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She had been preparing for this moment not just for weeks or months, but for years. Every public engagement, every charitable endeavor, every quiet moment of preparation had led to this. She was ready to make these promises, ready to bind her life to service, ready to take on the sacred trust being offered to her. The ancient ritual of anointing was about to begin, and felt the weight of 1,000 years of tradition settling around her like a sacred cloak. She and William were led to the specially prepared chairs that sat before the high altar, their hands clasped together even as protocol demanded they maintain their individual dignity. The archbishop approached with the holy oil, blessed according to traditions that stretched back to the Old Testament. This was perhaps the most sacred part of the entire ceremony, the moment when earthly leadership was transformed into something higher, something blessed by divine authority. Had read about this moment in history books, had studied the theological significance with tutors and advisors, but nothing had prepared her for the profound spirituality of actually experiencing it. As she knelt before the altar, felt herself surrounded by the presence of everyone who had ever meant something to her. Her parents, watching from their seats with tears streaming down their faces. Her children, safe but nearby, probably wondering when this long ceremony would end so they could have their promised treats. William's father, King Charles, who had abdicated just months earlier to allow this transition, his eyes bright with pride, and perhaps a touch of relief at passing on this enormous responsibility. But most powerfully, she felt the presence of those who could not be there. Diana's memory seemed especially close in this sacred space, where she had once as a member of the royal family. Had often wondered what Diana would think of this day, of seeing her son become king and her daughter-in-law become queen. Would she be proud of the man William had become? Would she approve of the partnership he and had built together? The holy oil was cool against her forehead as the archbishop made the sign of the cross. "Be thy head anointed with holy oil," he intoned, his voice carrying the weight of centuries, as kings and queens and priests were anointed. And as Solomon was anointed king by the priest and the prophet, so be thou anointed, blessed, and consecrated queen over the peoples whom the Lord thy God hath given thee to rule and govern. The words washed over like a blessing and a challenge. She felt something shift inside her, not a magical transformation, but a deeper settling into the role she had been preparing for. The oil dried on her skin, but its significance would remain with her forever. She was no longer just or even the Duchess of Cambridge. She was now, in the most fundamental way, queen, anointed and blessed to serve her people. William's anointing followed, and watched with eyes full of love and admiration as her husband accepted the sacred oils. His face was serene but deeply moved, and she could see in his expression the same sense of profound responsibility that was settling over her. This was the man she had fallen in love with at university, but it was also the King of England, blessed and consecrated to rule. Somehow, miraculously, he was both things at once. The presentation of the regalia came next, each ancient object heavy with symbolism and history. The golden spurs, representing knightly chivalry and the defense of the church. The jeweled sword, symbolizing the power to protect the weak and defend the realm. The bracelets of gold, representing sincerity and wisdom. But it was the ring that moved most deeply. As the archbishop placed the coronation ring on William's finger, she thought of their own wedding rings, simple bands of Welsh gold that they had exchanged in this very abbey years earlier. Those rings had bound them to each other in love and partnership. This new ring bound William to his nation in service and duty. Both were sacred commitments, both were made in love, both would last until death. Her own regalia was simpler but no less meaningful. The ring placed on her finger was delicate and beautiful, set with rubies and diamonds that caught the light from the abbey's ancient windows. As it slid onto her hand, felt the weight of generations of queens who had worn it before her. Queens who had ruled in their own right, queens who had supported their husbands' reigns, queens who had guided their nations through triumph and tragedy. The abbey fell into complete silence as the moment of crowning approached. Even outside, the crowd seemed to sense the sacred nature of what was happening. Could feel her heart beating in her throat as the archbishop lifted Edward's crown, the most sacred and ancient of all the royal regalia. The crown was magnificent and terrible at once. Crafted of solid gold and adorned with precious stones, it had crowned every monarch since Charles II. The weight was substantial, nearly 5 pounds of gold and gems, but knew the true weight would come from what it represented. The hopes and fears of millions of people, the responsibility for an ancient institution, the burden of making decisions that would affect not just her own family, but families across the nation and the Commonwealth. "God crown you with a crown of glory and righteousness," the archbishop proclaimed as he lowered the crown onto William's head. The moment it touched his brow, a transformation seemed to ripple through the abbey. The congregation rose as one, their voices joining in the ancient cry, "God save the King! God save the King!" Felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked at her husband, now truly King William V, the boy she had met at university, the man who made her laugh over dinner, the father who read bedtime stories to their children. He was all of those things and also this. A king, crowned in the sight of God and the people. Her own crowning followed moments later. As the archbishop approached with the queen consort's crown, felt time slow to a crawl. This crown was smaller than Edward's, but no less magnificent, its diamonds and pearls catching and reflecting the abbey's ancient light. It had been worn by queens before her, women who had faced their own challenges and triumphs while supporting their husbands and serving their people. "Receive the crown of glory, honor, and joy," the archbishop said as he placed it on her head. The weight settled onto her shoulders and spine, but rather than feeling burdened, felt elevated. The girl from was gone forever, replaced by someone she was still discovering. Queen by the grace of God. The congregation's response was thunderous. "God save the Queen!" But barely heard it over the sound of her own heartbeat and the whispered voice in her mind that sounded remarkably like her mother. "Be brave, be kind, be true to yourself." As the final prayers were said and the blessing given, and William knelt together one last time as private citizens, When they rose, they would walk out of the abbey as king and queen, crowned and anointed, ready to begin the most important work of their lives. The recessional music began, triumphant and joyful, filling every corner of the ancient space. William offered his arm, and together they began the slow walk back down the aisle. But everything looked different now. The faces in the congregation seemed brighter, more hopeful. The banners and flowers seemed more vibrant. Even the ancient stones of the abbey seemed to glow with approval. Halfway down the aisle, caught sight of her children again. George was standing, understanding perhaps for the first time that his parents were now king and queen, that his own destiny had shifted in this moment. Charlotte was waving excitedly, delighted by all the pageantry. Louis was asleep in his nanny's arms, blissfully unaware that his parents had just become two of the most important people in the world. The sight of her children grounded in a way that nothing else could. Whatever else this day meant, whatever responsibilities they had just accepted, they were still parents first. They would still tuck their children into bed tonight, still help with homework, still kiss scraped knees better. The crown would change many things, but it would not change their love for their family. As they approached the great west door of the abbey, could hear the crowds outside growing louder. The moment they stepped through those doors, they would be king and queen not just in ceremony but in reality. The weight of that knowledge was enormous, but so was the sense of possibility. She squeezed William's arm gently, and he looked down at her with that familiar smile that had sustained her through every challenge they had faced together. Whatever came next, they would face it as they had faced everything else, together with love and determination and an unshakable faith in each other. The doors swung open, and light flooded in from the world outside. The roar of the crowd was overwhelming, a wall of sound that seemed to lift them up and carry them forward. Cameras flashed like stars, capturing the moment for history and for the billions of people around the world who were watching this ancient ceremony unfold. But found herself looking past the cameras and the protocol officers to the faces in the crowd. There was such joy there, such hope and excitement. These people had taken time from their lives to witness this moment, to be part of something larger than themselves. They believed in the institution of monarchy, in the possibility of service and sacrifice, in the idea that some things were worth preserving across generations. The state coach waited for them, its gold leaf gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. As they settled into its plush interior, felt the full weight of the crown for the first time. It was heavy, yes, but it was also beautiful, and it represented something beautiful. The idea that leadership could be about service rather than power, that privilege came with responsibility, that some people were willing to dedicate their entire lives to something larger than their own happiness. As the coach began to move, looked out at the crowds lining the route. Children were perched on their parents' shoulders, waving flags and cheering. Elderly people sat in wheelchairs along the barriers, many of them crying with emotion. Young couples held hands and took pictures, creating memories they would treasure forever. Each face told a story, represented a life that she and William would now touch in some small way through their reign. The thought was humbling and inspiring at once. They had been given an extraordinary privilege and an extraordinary responsibility. The question now was whether they would prove worthy of both. The coach rolled slowly through the streets of London, past landmarks that had witnessed centuries of history. Big Ben chimed in the distance, marking the hour of their triumph. The Thames flowed steadily beside them, as it had flowed past kings and queens for 1,000 years. Everything was the same, and everything was different. Reached over and took William's hand, feeling the unfamiliar weight of his coronation ring against her fingers. He squeezed back, and in that simple gesture, she felt all the love and partnership that had brought them to this moment. "Are you ready for this?" he asked quietly, his voice just audible over the crowd noise outside. Looked out at the celebrating crowds, thought of their children waiting for them at the palace, considered the enormous tasks that lay ahead of them. Then she looked back at the man she loved, now crowned King of England, and felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. "Yes," she said simply, "I'm ready." The coach continued its stately progress through the heart of London, carrying them toward palace and toward whatever adventures their reign would bring. Behind them, Westminster Abbey stood proud and ancient, having witnessed yet another chapter in the long story of the British monarchy. Ahead of them lay the future, uncertain but full of possibility. As Queen of the United Kingdom, she was ready to face whatever came next. The Golden State coach rolled through the streets of London like a vessel carrying precious cargo through a sea of celebration. Sat beside William, their coronation crowns still heavy on their heads, watching in wonder as thousands upon thousands of people lined every inch of the route back to palace. The emotion in the crowd was palpable, a living thing that seemed to reach through the ornate windows of the coach and wrap around her heart. She had been part of royal processions before, had waved to crowds and smiled for cameras countless times over the years. But this was different in every conceivable way. These were not just well-wishers celebrating a royal wedding or a special anniversary. These were subjects greeting their new sovereigns, people who had chosen to spend their day witnessing the beginning of a new era in British history. A group of pressed against the barriers, their small faces painted with Union Jack flags, their voices joining together in a spontaneous rendition of God Save the King. Their teachers stood behind them, many wiping away tears, understanding perhaps better than their young charges the historical significance of this moment. Found herself thinking of all the children across the nation and the Commonwealth who were watching this ceremony on television, forming their first memories of their new king and queen. As the coach rounded Park Corner, caught sight of an elderly veteran in his wheelchair, wearing his medals with obvious pride. He raised a shaking hand in salute as they passed, and William immediately responded with a small wave directly toward the man. The gesture was subtle but profound, a recognition of service and sacrifice that set the tone for the reign that was beginning. The coach slowed as they approached Wellington Arch, allowing the crowds more time to see them, to cheer, to feel part of this historic moment. Used those extra moments to truly observe the people who had come to celebrate with them. She saw a mother holding a baby who couldn't have been more than a few months old, already sharing this moment with the next generation. She saw teenagers taking endless photos, their excitement infectious. She saw couples in their 80s who had probably witnessed Queen Elizabeth's coronation as young people, now seeing the cycle continue with William and herself. "Look at them," William murmured beside her, his voice filled with wonder. "They're so happy." Nodded, feeling overwhelmed by the generosity of spirit she was witnessing. These people had no guarantee that she and William would be good monarchs, no certainty that their reign would bring prosperity or peace. But they were choosing to believe, choosing to hope, choosing to celebrate the possibility of positive change and continued stability. A banner in the crowd caught her attention. "Welcome King William and Queen, a new chapter begins." The words were simple, hand-painted on but they captured something profound about the moment. This was indeed a new chapter, not just for the monarchy, but for the nation itself. The long reign of Queen Elizabeth II had provided stability and continuity through decades of change. Now it was time for William and to write their own story, to face the challenges of the 21st century with the wisdom of centuries of tradition behind them. As they traveled down Constitution Hill toward the palace, found herself thinking about the concept of service that had been woven throughout the coronation ceremony. She had always understood intellectually that royal life was about duty and service, but the weight of that understanding had just become intensely personal. Every decision she and William made from this day forward would affect millions of people. Every public appearance would be watched and analyzed. Every word they spoke would carry the weight of the crown. But rather than feeling intimidated by this responsibility, found herself feeling energized. She thought about the causes she was passionate about: mental health awareness, early childhood development, supporting military families. As queen, she would have an unprecedented platform to advocate for these issues, to bring attention to problems that needed solving, to highlight the work of people who were making a difference in their communities. The palace came into view ahead of them, its familiar facade now representing home in a completely new way. Had spent countless hours in those rooms over the years, had celebrated holidays and birthdays within those walls, had raised her children in the private apartments. But now the palace would be more than a residence. It would be the working headquarters of their reign, the place where they would meet with world leaders and make decisions that would shape the future of the nation. Crowds filled every available space around the palace, from the Victoria Memorial to James's Park. People had climbed trees for better views, had brought camping chairs and picnic blankets, had made a festival of their wait to see the newly crowned king and queen. The atmosphere was jubilant but respectful, celebratory but deeply reverent. As the coach passed through the palace gates, felt a profound shift in her understanding of what home meant. The gates that closed behind them didn't just separate private from public space. They marked the boundary between their old lives and their new reality. When they emerged from the coach, they would be king and queen not just in ceremony, but in every moment of every day for the rest of their lives. Palace staff lined the courtyard, many of them people had known for years. Mrs., who managed the household staff, was crying openly. Thomas, the head gardener, stood at attention but couldn't hide his proud smile. These were the people who made royal life possible, who worked behind the scenes to maintain the traditions and protocols that supported the monarchy. Seeing their emotion reminded that this transition affected not just her and William, but everyone who was part of the extended royal household. The coach came to a stop, and for a moment, William sat in silence, still holding hands, still processing the magnitude of what had just happened. Through the coach windows, they could see the crowd gathered in front of the palace, waiting for the traditional balcony appearance that would officially present them to the nation as their new sovereigns. "The children will be waiting," William said softly, and felt her heart lift at the reminder. George, Charlotte, and Louis would be in the palace, probably bursting with questions about the ceremony, eager to see their parents in their crowns, ready to be part of the balcony appearance that would introduce them to the world as the children of the reigning monarch. A footman opened the coach door, and William stepped out first, turning to offer his hand to. As her feet touched the palace courtyard, she felt the weight of the crown shift slightly, reminding her of its presence. But she also felt something else, a deep sense of rightness, of being exactly where she was meant to be at exactly the right moment. The palace doors opened, and her children came running toward them, their formal ceremony clothes slightly disheveled from the excitement of the day. George reached them first, his young face serious but proud. "Mummy," he said quietly, "you look like a real queen." The simple honesty of the observation brought tears to Si's. "I am a real queen now, darling," she said, kneeling carefully despite the weight of her ceremonial dress to hug him. "But I'm still your mummy first." Charlotte arrived next, her eyes wide with wonder at its crown. "Can I try it on?" she asked with typical 6-year-old directness, causing the nearby palace staff to hide their smiles. "It's a bit heavy for you right now, sweetheart," said gently, "but perhaps when you're older." Little Louis was last to reach them, toddling on unsteady legs and reaching up to be lifted. William scooped him up carefully, mindful of his own crown, and Louis immediately reached for the shiny objects on his father's head. "Pretty hat, Daddy," Louis declared, causing everyone within hearing to laugh. The innocent comment perfectly captured the surreal nature of the moment. These ancient symbols of power and authority reduced to pretty hats by a 3-year-old who only cared that his parents had returned safely from their long day away. Palace advisors began approaching discreetly, ready to brief them on the schedule for the rest of the day. There would be the balcony appearance, followed by a formal reception for the coronation guests, then a private family dinner before the state banquet in the evening. Every moment was planned and choreographed, every appearance calculated for maximum positive impact. But for now, in this brief private moment with their children, allowed herself to simply be a mother. She straightened Charlotte's hair ribbon and listened to George's serious questions about what being king meant for their family. She watched William blow raspberries on Louis's cheek, delighting the little boy and forgetting for a moment that he was now one of the most powerful men in the world. "Ma'am, Your Majesty," the private secretary approached carefully, still adjusting to the new titles. "The crowds are ready for the balcony appearance." Felt her stomach flutter with nerves. The balcony of Palace was perhaps the most famous balcony in the world, the place where the royal family appeared for all their most significant moments. She had stood there before, but never as queen, never with the weight of the crown on her head and the hopes of the nation in her heart. "Are you ready?" William asked, echoing his earlier question but with a different weight to it now. Looked at her children, gathered around them in their best clothes, excited to be part of history. She thought about the crowds waiting outside, the people who had traveled from across the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth to witness this moment. She considered the weight of the crown on her head and the responsibility it represented. "Yes," she said, meaning it completely. "Let's go show the world their new royal family." Together, they walked through the palace corridors toward the center balcony. With each step, felt herself settling more completely into her new role. The nervous university student was gone forever. The hesitant girlfriend who had worried about fitting into royal life was a distant memory. Even the confident Duchess of Cambridge had been transformed into something new. The balcony doors stood open before them, and beyond them could hear the roar of the crowd that had been waiting patiently for this moment. As they approached the opening, the sound grew louder, more excited, more joyful. William stepped onto the balcony first, and the crowd erupted. "Long live the king!" echoed across the palace grounds and beyond, a sound that seemed to carry on the wind across all of London. Followed, and the cheers doubled in volume. "Long live the Queen!" joined the calls for William, creating a wall of sound that was both overwhelming and uplifting. But it was when the children appeared that the crowd truly lost control. The sight of George, Charlotte, and Louis stepping onto the balcony in their formal wear, representing the future of the monarchy, sent people into raptures of joy and pride. Standing there on that famous balcony, with her crown catching the afternoon sunlight and her family surrounding her, felt the full meaning of the day settle into her heart. This was not just about her and William anymore. This was about the continuation of an institution that had guided the nation for over 1,000 years. This was about providing stability and continuity in an uncertain world. This was about service, sacrifice, and the willingness to dedicate their lives to something larger than themselves. The crowd below stretched as far as the eye could see, a sea of faces all turned toward them with hope and celebration. Flags waved in the breeze, creating splashes of red, white, and blue against the green of the parks. People were crying and laughing and cheering all at once, overwhelmed by the emotion of witnessing history unfold before their eyes. As raised her hand to wave at the assembled throngs, she felt a deep sense of connection to every person below. These were her people now, their hopes and dreams and challenges now her responsibility. It was an enormous burden, but it was also the greatest honor she could imagine. The moment stretched on, perfect and eternal, as Queen stood beside her king and their children, ready to begin the adventure of their reign. The afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across the palace grounds as finally stepped back from the balcony, her hand still tingling from waving to the enormous crowd below. The cheers continued even after the family had retreated inside, a constant reminder of the nation's joy and expectation. But now, in the relative quiet of the palace corridors, the weight of what had just transpired began to settle around her like a cloak, both heavy and warm. Louis had fallen asleep in William's arms during their final moments on the balcony, overwhelmed by the day's excitement and the late afternoon sun. Charlotte skipped alongside them, chattering excitedly about all the pretty dresses she had seen and asking when they could have their own coronation party. George walked more sedately, his young mind clearly processing the magnitude of what had happened to his family. "Mummy," George said quietly as they made their way toward the private family quarters, "when I'm king, will it be as scary as it looked today?" His heart clenched at the question. At 10 years old, George was already beginning to understand the weight of his own destiny, the knowledge that he too would one day wear the crown that now rested heavily on his father's head. She knelt down to his level, mindful of her elaborate dress and precious crown. "It wasn't scary, darling," she said gently. "It was the most beautiful and important day of our lives, and when your time comes, you'll be ready because we'll help you prepare, just as Granny Elizabeth helped Daddy prepare." George nodded seriously, seeming satisfied with her answer, but made a mental note to speak with the child psychologists and advisors about how to help their children process not just today's events, but the lifetime of preparation and responsibility that lay ahead of them. The private apartments felt like a sanctuary after the public grandeur of the day. Here, surrounded by family photos and children's artwork, the everyday debris of normal family life could almost pretend that nothing had changed. Almost, except for the crown still resting on her head, and the way the palace staff looked at her now with a mixture of familiarity and new reverence. Mrs. the children's nanny approached with practiced efficiency. "Shall I take the children for their tea, Your Majesty?" The title sounded strange in this domestic setting, but was already beginning to understand that there would be no separation between her public and private selves now. She was queen in every moment, whether she was conducting state business or reading bedtime stories. "Yes, please," said gratefully, "but keep them close. We'll need them for the family photographs shortly." As the children were led away, chattering about their adventure, and William found themselves alone for the first time since early that morning. The silence between them was profound, filled with shared understanding of how completely their lives had just changed. William reached up and carefully lifted the crown from his head, setting it on the ornate table that had been prepared for the royal regalia. The gesture seemed to release some of the tension from his shoulders, though noticed he still carried himself differently, more formally, as if the weight of kingship had settled permanently into his posture. "How are you feeling?" he asked, moving to help with her own crown. His hands were gentle as he lifted the precious weight from her head, but she could feel a slight tremor in his fingers that betrayed his own emotional exhaustion. "Different," said honestly, running her hands through her hair where the crown had pressed against it. "The same, but completely different. Does that make sense?" William nodded, understanding perfectly. They had been preparing for this day for years, had known it would come eventually. But no amount of preparation could have them for the actual feeling of transformation, the moment when they stopped being people who would someday be king and queen and became people who actually were. A soft knock on the door interrupted their brief moment of privacy. "Majesties," came the voice of their private secretary. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but we have the official photographer ready for the family portraits, and the Prime Minister is requesting a brief audience before the state dinner." The royal machinery was already in motion, the endless cycle of duty and ceremony that would define the rest of their lives. Felt a fleeting moment of nostalgia for the simpler days when they could spend a quiet evening at home without the weight of state business pressing upon them. But as they prepared for the next round of obligations, found herself thinking not about what they had lost, but about what they had gained. The power to make a real difference in people's lives. The platform to advocate for causes they cared deeply about. The opportunity to represent not just Britain, but the values of service, dedication, and quiet dignity that the monarchy at its best embodied. The official photographs took place in the throne room, that magnificent space that had seen so many historic moments over the centuries. And William sat on the thrones that had been used for the coronation, still wearing their ceremonial robes, while the children arranged themselves around them with varying degrees of cooperation. George stood straight and proud beside his father's chair, already showing signs of the dignity that would serve him well in his future role. Charlotte couldn't resist making faces at the camera when she thought no one was looking, bringing precious moments of levity to the formal proceedings. Louis alternated between charming smiles and attempts to escape, keeping everyone on their toes. But it was during the quieter moments between shots that felt the day's true significance settling around her. As she watched William interact with the photographer, saw how naturally he commanded the room even while being accommodating and kind, she understood that he truly was ready for this role. The boy she had fallen in love with had become the king the nation needed. The Prime Minister's audience was brief but significant. As he bowed formally upon entering the room, felt the shift in her relationship to the political process. No longer was she simply a member of the royal family observing from the sidelines. She was now queen, with her own constitutional role to play in the governance of the nation. "Your Majesty," the Prime Minister said to William, "on behalf of the government and the people, I want to express our joy at your coronation and our confidence in your reign. And Your Majesty," he continued, turning to, "we are honored to serve under your guidance as well." The conversation that followed was formal but warm, touching on immediate priorities for the government, upcoming state visits, and the broader challenges facing the nation. Listened carefully, beginning to understand how different her perspective would be now that she was part of the constitutional framework rather than simply observing it. As evening approached, the pace of activity in the palace intensified. The state banquet was the culmination of Coronation Day, bringing together heads of state and dignitaries from around the world to celebrate the beginning of the new reign. It was perhaps the most important diplomatic event of William and S's lives so far, setting the tone for their relationships with world leaders for years to come. His dress for the evening was a masterpiece of British design and craftsmanship, created specifically for this occasion. As she stood before the mirror in her dressing room, watching her personal dresser make final adjustments, she marveled at how different she looked from the young woman who had gotten ready that morning. The day had aged her, not physically but spiritually. There was a gravitas to her reflection now, a sense of settled purpose that hadn't been there before. The state dining room had been transformed into something that looked like a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables set with the finest china and silver, arrangements of British flowers perfuming the air with subtle fragrance. Every detail had been planned to showcase the best of British hospitality and tradition. As the guests filed in presidents and prime ministers, kings and queens from across the Commonwealth and beyond felt the weight of representing her nation to the world. These relationships would be crucial for Britain's future, and the impressions made tonight would resonate for years to come. But it was the moments of genuine human connection that moved her most. The elderly Queen of Denmark, who had known William since he was a child, embraced him warmly, and spoke of her pride in watching him come into his inheritance. The president of South Africa shared stories of his own nation's hopes for continued strong ties with Britain under the new reign. During the formal toasts, when William spoke eloquently about service, partnership, and the shared challenges facing the modern world, felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with protocol or ceremony. This was the man she had married speaking with wisdom and authority about issues that mattered. His words carried weight now not just because of who he was, but because of the office he held and the responsibility he bore. Her own brief remarks focused on the role of women in modern leadership and the importance of supporting families and communities in times of change. As she spoke, looking out at the assembled world leaders, understood that her voice now carried far beyond the causes she had championed as Duchess. She could speak for women and families not just in Britain, but around the world. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, and William found themselves walking slowly through the palace corridors, still in their formal evening wear, processing the enormity of everything that had happened. The crown jewels had been returned to the Tower of London, but the weight of what they represented remained. "Do you think we did well today?" William asked as they paused in front of a portrait of Queen Victoria, another young woman who had faced the challenge of ruling an empire. "I think we did exactly what we needed to do," replied. "We showed up, we served, we represented the best of what the monarchy can be, and we did it together." They made their way to the nursery to check on their children one final time. George was fast asleep, but even in sleep he looked somehow older, as if the day's events had marked him as surely as they had marked his parents. Charlotte was curled up with her favorite stuffed animal, a slight smile on her face that suggested she was dreaming of crowds and pretty dresses. Louis slept the deep sleep of a toddler who had been thoroughly overwhelmed by the day's excitement. Standing there in the nursery, surrounded by the quiet evidence of normal family life, felt the pieces of her new reality settling into place. She was Queen of England now, with all the responsibility and privilege that entailed. But she was also a mother, a wife, a woman who had been shaped by love and loss and the ordinary struggles of growing up. The day that had begun with such ceremony and grandeur ended quietly, with two people who loved each other taking off their formal clothes and preparing for bed just like any other married couple. But as brushed her teeth and William set his alarm for the busy schedule that awaited them tomorrow, they both understood that they were no longer just any other couple. They were king and queen, crowned and anointed, blessed and burdened with the hopes of a nation. They were the latest link in a chain that stretched back over 1,000 years, the chapter in a story that was both theirs to write and larger than anything they could have imagined. As they settled into bed, felt William reach for her hand in the darkness. His fingers were warm and familiar, grounding her in the love that had brought them to this moment. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever tests their reign might face, they would face them as they had faced everything else together. Outside their window, London settled into sleep around them. But somewhere in the distance, could still hear the faint sounds of celebration, people still marking this historic day with joy and hope. Tomorrow would bring new responsibilities, new challenges, new opportunities to serve. But tonight, Queen and King William slept peacefully, ready to begin the great adventure of their reign, secure in the knowledge that they had been called to this role not just by birth or circumstance, but by love for each other, love for their children, and love for the people they had sworn to serve.